Hello and welcome back. So this is our second video in our series. We're going to be building on what we learned in the introductory, the overview and concepts, and we're going to be focusing this video particularly on timeline, building timelines, the functions, a little bit more about clip navigation and some extra tools. We're going to round it off with some conforming, and we're going to have a first look, hopefully, at timeline effects as well. So we've got an awful lot to do. Like I said before, this is going to be like a big overview. We're not going to cram everything about Flame into these 6 videos, but we're just going to try and give you a taster and get you up and running as quickly as we can. So this is where we left off with our desktop. There's a couple of things I just want to go through that's going to be beneficial as we work through this about general navigation. So we talked very quickly about using the escape key and the tilde key to kind of toggle us backwards and forwards between the desktop and the standard view. But when we're actually looking at a particular clip, if we go to our standard view, hit escape, you want to kind of navigate around these views at some point. So if you look down here, we've got some fairly obvious tools. We've got sort of like a tool that takes you to a different percentage setting. So you could go like 100% on a clip. We've got a little button here that fits you back to home, and then we've got something that will toggle you backwards and forwards between the last two states. Now, at some point, you probably want to zoom in or manipulate, if you've got a big image, into these as well. So a couple of hotkeys that are really useful, once again, like the escape key, I would urge you to learn these fairly rapidly, is that if we hold down the space bar, you can see that it turns into a little hand icon and we can manipulate the clip around in the viewport. Now the good news is that this space bar is universal. So if we come down here and we hold the space bar over the timeline, we can pan the timeline. And in this view as well, if we had lots of clips in here, we can also use the space bar to pan through that view. So space bar is used for panning everywhere. This is a good thing. Now, if you want to zoom, if we hold down Control and Spacebar, then it gives us an infinite smooth zooming function, which is kind of good. And you can see that the percentage change there as well, which is quite nice. If you want to go back to 100% or home or just go to fit, you can hit those 2 buttons quickly. The same is also true for the timeline view. So if we come down here as well and hit Control and Space, you can see that we can steplessly zoom inside the timeline, release control, and then we can pan around. Hitting the home button down here will take you back to that view. Now, don't be confused with the magnifying glass. That's actually a search function that we'll look at a little bit later in the series. So the home button for the timeline, home button for the viewport. You've also got down here these bars to manipulate. So if we kind of scrub in a little bit, we zoom into our timeline, you can see that now we have these scrub bars where we can use them to pan. Now, also the function with this, if we just go back and home the view again, if you tap and drag up and down in these also act as a zoom function. And you've also got a scrub bar to the right of the screen, which allows you to kind of zoom the actual timeline segment height. Once again, home will take you back to a standard view. Now, a lot of the contextual menus and a lot of the menu items contain hints to what the shortcut is for particular things. You can see a couple of them in the drop-down menu for the viewport here as well. But if you get totally lost or you want to know a specific hotkey, you've got a sort of a fairly good idea of what it is, you can always use this function down here, the keyboard shortcut menu. And this brings up like an interface that lists every hotkey. This is where you would navigate and find hotkeys that you want to learn. And it's also where you're allowed, you can set custom hotkey configurations as well for particular functions that you like. So if we just take our zooming viewport for a second, if we just type in the search window zoom and we hit search, it will highlight and go through in a list all the entries that have the word zoom in. So you can see here that continuous zoom is control space, and if we hit the up and down arrows, that will take us through the available list of functions that are associated with the word zoom. So it's all kind of quite nice. So don't forget, down that menu, keyboard shortcuts will help you very quickly learn and customize some of the shortcuts inside of Flame to make your working experience even more pleasant. So now we know how to manipulate clips in the viewport. We know how to get some clips in. Let's look at building some manual timelines, and let's look at some of the basic editorial functionality that Flame has to offer us. So to start off with, we're going to get rid of all of these clips. Now, if you want to keep your desktop called ships, and you don't want to reset it, you can actually come down here. We can throw these away one by one. If you hover over a clip, don't tap it, just hover over and hit the D key on the keyboard, you can see that you will delete clips. If you hold down Shift D, we can actually clear out a whole reel but whilst maintaining the name of our desktop. And of course, if you just want to reset your desktop completely to clear it out, make sure you've saved it. If you've got work in there that you want to come back to, you can obviously come back up here and just go clear desktop. So now we've cleared out our reels. I'm going to go back to our media hub and we're going to browse down. I made a little bookmark now, so I don't have to keep hunting for that. Back to where our footage is, and we're going to bring in a couple of clips. Okay, now once again, if we kind of look at the preview window for here, you can see that as we go through some of these, you're going to see that this first clip here is 1280 by 720. We're going to find another ship video down here. We've got this one as well. This is quite big. This is Ultra HD, different frame rate. And we've got another one down here that's 1920 by 1080. So we've got 3 different resolutions. So let's select that clip, control, hit that clip and that clip. And we're going to pick those up. I'm going to bring them into our middle reel for a second. Come back to our timeline. So this is pretty much like we did before, but we're going to look at how we start analyzing some of the properties of the clips, and also when we start building timelines, how Flame handles multiple resolutions. Now, in some other applications, if you're used to editing, you set kind of like a default project timeline resolution. And if you look at things like DaVinci Resolve, certainly when you bring in mismatched clips, it says, do you want to reset those settings? Not sure how some of the other applications deal with it, but Flame is fairly agnostic. But there are a few rules that when we start building actual timelines, that you need to be aware of. So if you want to find out some information about these clips, you can see that actually on the clip we've got some information on, like how many video tracks, audio tracks, sort of length of the clip, and when we scrub through. But if you tap down on the clip whilst holding the Alt key down, you see you get a much more expanded info panel. You get a little thumbnail. You can see heads and tails, record length, source length, and where it actually came from, and also things like the clip name, the tape name, resolution, etc., etc. And if you just keep holding down Alt and you go from clip to clip, you can see the information for each of those clips there. While we're looking at information, the actual workspace panel also contains a wealth of information as well. Now, when we were playing around with this the other day with the media panel, we can hide it and go half height, as it were. But if we all of a sudden just go full width, this completely takes over the screen. Everything is still there. We've just taken up the interface with the info panel, with the workspace. And this actually contains some quite useful information. If we come down and change it from tiles to a list view, once again, we can see a thumbnail representation of the clip there. These ones we can't scrub, but if you come down to the bottom right, we can actually make them different size, make them quite large. And this is going to be a more detailed view of all the information that's on the clip. You can see that we've got even more information than when we just Alt clicked on that clip as well. So you come back here, take it back from full width. You can see also there's a little hotkey, and actually if we hold down Control Shift and swipe, you can very quickly expand that view over. And you also notice that this view is actually kind of context aware. So it knows that when I was in this sort of like skinny view, we've got scrubbable thumbnails, but when I decided to go to my list view, I decided to change those scrubbable thumbnails to actually static ones, and it will respect the state of each of those views. So once again, it's quite nice. So Control Shift gets you that info panel. Now we can actually make a timeline or a sequence, actually, as we call it in Flame, in a variety of ways. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually take this red boy clip. And you notice that on the desktop, we've got like reels 1, 2, and 3, but at the bottom, we've got this sequences reel. Now, when we start doing some conforming, this is quite important, but I would also just urge you to get into the habit of, your timelines that you're going to build could, technically be anywhere in the desktop or in the workspace. But if you get in the habit of building and working on your sequences in the sequence reel, then it will just become natural and you'll know where your actual physical timelines are going to be. Now, up to now, we've been dealing with these clips as sources. And if you notice down here on the tab, when we select the different clips, that obviously loads it into the timeline view and also into the standard player. But they're all sort of like motifed with a green tab, right? So for us, green means that it's a source. Now, any clip we can turn from a source into a timeline, as we call it inside of Flame, a sequence. And you do that in a couple of ways. If you want to use a clip like this red boy as the starting point of our timeline, we're going to drop it down to our sequence reel. We're going to right click on this. And if you if you're starting to get a bit of RSI with all the right clicking on the mouse or on your pen, because I'm using a Wacom tablet here, on your keyboard, the Windows key, or they call it the Meta key, if you hold that down and tap, it will invoke up that little contextual menu there as well. So it's a little bit easier on the fingers, and it gets both hands involved so one doesn't go to sleep. So if we come to our menu option and go open as sequence, you're going to see that now a red border has come around the buoy, and also this is changed from being a source. There's now no source selected. The only thing that we've got selected is actually this red buoy. This is now the start of my sequence. This is actually a timeline. And if I alt click into this, you can see that the resolution of this is 1280 by 720 and it's 25 frames per second. Now, when we start editing into this timeline, a couple of things are going to happen automatically. So essentially what we've done here is we've started off a sequence with this clip, and the resolution of my timeline is this. Now, this has nothing to do with the default settings that we had for our project. Each timeline can be its own resolution, but when we do start up a timeline, it does need to have a resolution, a frame rate, and a bit depth. Now, when we bring in items that are not the same as this, say that we, as we do here, we have some different resolution clips, we have some different frame rates. Flame kind of helps you quite a lot. So down our editing tools down here, we're going to leave this to snap being on. Ripple is off at the moment, so it's going to be in an overwrite. And we're going to take this clip, make sure we're at the head of the clip. We're going to pick it up and we're going to drop it down. You can see that as we do that, it starts to do a couple of things. We're going to look at how we create tracks in a little while, but initially we're just going to drop this in here, and you're going to see that when you actually start playing with this, you'll feel a snap happening at that particular point. Now, when we release this, because this clip is a different frame rate or a different size, we're going to get like a little warning dialog up here saying just what's going to happen. So this is a mismatched frame rate. We're editing a 2997 clip into a 25 frame destination. Do you want to proceed with that? And by and large, you would go, yes, I do. So what you're going to see now is, if we just frame everything here, is that this is we've got some audio with this as well, and we've created some audio tracks automatically. This is basically our new media coming in. The source, even though we picked this up and dropped it down, actually stays back in the reel. And we now have this clip edited in. So if we go to our standard player now, and we go from this clip to this clip, a couple of things have happened. So looking at our first clip here, and we're just going to select it, you can see that underneath our play controls, we've got this little mini bar, and this sort of tracks the progress of the clip as it comes into the system. We'll look at this a bit later on. This is actually living in a timeline, and then we have the opportunity to add some effects after this into the pipeline of the edit. So this one, because this is a clip we started off with, pretty much is just as it came in. It's vanilla flavored. But as soon as we go to this clip and we select this clip, you can see that, oh, hello, it's added some effects on here. Now, it's added 2 effects to make this clip conform to the resolution and the frame rate of the timeline that we established with this clip here. The first one is an automatic time warp. So it's actually time warping this dynamically down to be the same frame rate as the first clip, or the format of the timeline. And the next thing it's doing, because this clip is actually quite a lot bigger, this clip was originally 3840, so it's an Ultra HD clip, it's almost 4K. And of course our timeline is only 1280 by 720. We need to resize this in some way. So all of these tools underneath have like a quick access menu bar. So if we look at our resize tools for a second, there's quite a lot of things down here. We can affect how this is resized, but essentially we've got a crop box and we've got a resizing method. If we go to the resizing method, at the moment the default is it's a center crop. So it's actually sort of cutting out a section to fit into here. But really what we would like is it for it all to fit in quite nicely. So if we go into center crop and change that for argument's sake to letterbox, then it's going to kind of fit that into the format. Once again, if you go to crop edges or fill, depending on the aspect and the size of this, you'll get a slightly different result. But essentially now we fitted that Ultra HD 4K clip into our 1280 720 timeline, and we can just go through and just literally play that back on the fly. and it will do all that resize as we go. So this is really good. So coming back to once again to our desktop here, if we get this clip now and we bring that down, then a similar thing is going to be happening. Okay, we're going to drop that in. It's going to give us a warning. We can confirm that. And now if we come back to our standard view, we have all those clips nicely resized and all sort of playing well inside the timeline. So it's a very intuitive way of working. We just establish a resolution for our timeline. This way we do it with a clip, and then we drop all these elements in, and Flame will go ahead and just automatically take care of the timing and the resizing for us. Now another way of working is that we can actually go through and we can create our own custom sequence and start editing items into that. So what we're going to do here is we're not going to delete this, but hitting this little cross here changes the state of our sequence from being a sequence, a timeline, back into just a normal source. So if you look at this, even though this was just a timeline a minute ago, this was a sequence that you would edit into, and you still can. We can change that state at any point. As far as we're concerned, we've just changed that status back to it being a source. Now, don't get too confused about all this. It just means that inside of Flame, a clip on the desktop can be several things. It can be an edit. It can be a static source, which can just be a clip, or it could be a single frame. The representation on the desktop is all the same for us, and we just decide when we want to change that state from being a source into a timeline. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just delete this timeline for a second, and I'm going to go back to my media hub, and I'm going to bring in my boy clip again. So I'm going to kind of drop that into that reel, and I'm just going to go and pick up just a couple more ship clips. I'm going to pick up this one here, and we're going to pick up this one here. That's all good. We're going to drop those in as well. So now we have a sort of like a list of sources in this particular reel, and instead of using one of those clips to be the starting of my edit, my sequence, down in my sequence reel, which is empty at the moment, I'm going to right click in here and I'm going to create a new sequence. So this is going to create a new empty timeline at the resolution that I want and the frame rate and everything else. So we're going to call this rough edit for a second. We're going to set it back down to 1920 by 1080. 16:9, 8-bit progressive, and we're going to make the duration initially say 500 frames. And once again, this doesn't really matter because when we start adding more material in, the timeline is going to dynamically grow, but we don't really want it to be one frame because that's just a little bit fiddly to work with. And we're going to leave it with one track of audio stereo. So when we create this, you can see now down here that we have effectively like an empty timeline. We have like an empty container for which to start editing clips into. Now for this, we're going to change the layout of the desktop so it's a little bit more conducive to what you would expect to a normal editing system. So, you know, this is all very nice about going through and picking clips up and dropping them in. But, you know, if you're doing editing, it's maybe not the traditional source record view that you're used to. And we can actually deal with that quite easily. If we come down here where we decide on what we kind of look at, remember from the first video, you can look at our reels and freeform, we can go player, but we can also change this to a thing that's called source sequence. And what that does then is actually sets up two viewports as you would get from a normal editor. So on the right hand side here, this is going to be a representation of our empty edit at the moment, and on the left hand side here, this is also going to be a representation of whatever source we select. Now once again, we don't want to keep ping-ponging back in and out of this kind of view because that all gets a little bit of annoying. So once again, this is where the workspace panel comes into its own. It's kind of like a really nice way of being able to, from anywhere in your workspace, from your desktop, from any of the libraries, being able to load those clips into the source viewer to decide on what you actually want to use with editing. So once again, we're going to start off with, we're going to start with this clip. We're just going to work down. It'd be nice and easy. Now you may want to use all the clip, but chances are when you're doing edit, you probably only want to have a section. So maybe this first bit, we're going to take something like this. This is going to be the beginning of my clip. We'll set an in point, and we're going to come down here, and maybe just as it goes out of shot, something like that, we'll set an out point. So we can do a couple of things to get this into the timeline now. For sure, we can actually pick up the clip and we can drag it into my actual timeline and decide on where I want to position it. And if we do that and release it, it's going to once again warn us. It will do a resize on this as well. And this will be my ins and out points. You can see I still have access to my heads and tails at the end of the clip. If we just undo that for a second, maybe you want to use some hotkeys, or we've actually got some dedicated buttons down here. Now, what I'm going to tell you is really important. Whenever we do a gestural operation, which is picking a clip up and dropping it down into the timeline like this, the editing functionality will take notice of how these buttons are set. So basically with ripple off, we're in overwrite mode. So by doing this, it will overwrite any other clips of media that are in the timeline at that point. So for argument's sake, if we came down to this point and we selected maybe the boy shot, and once again we set an in point there and an out point there, this is a section I'm going to be using. We're going to drop it in where the positioner is, ripple is off. So when I come down here and I do this, what's going to happen is it's actually going to overwrite that clip. You can see here that basically that part of that clip has disappeared and we've overwritten it with the new one coming in. So just going to undo that for a second. If we change it to ripple and do the same thing and drop that in here, you can see what it will do now is it will make a cut at that point. It will drop my cut in, my clip that I've just selected, and then after that runs out, the clip that was originally there has been pushed along. It's been rippled down the timeline to sort of take back over. So just be aware that when you're doing things gesturally, Flame is always going to take notice of the status of these buttons. But if we're going to start using things like hotkeys, or if we're going to use these dedicated buttons here, then regardless of the state of these, the hotkey, all of these buttons will always take precedence. So this button will always be an overwrite. This button will always be a ripple insert, regardless of how these are set up. And the blue button over here just contains some additional quite handy features that we'll go through and look at. So if you're more akin to using hotkeys, which most people are in editors, I mean, they will do some drag and drop, but most people for speed will start using some of the hotkey functionality. Then we need to know that how this is going to be going into the timeline. So at the moment, I've got an in and an out point on my source, and I have a positioner set inside of my timeline, my sequence. This is also the primary track. This is also the video track that this is going to edit into. So if I'm not dragging and dropping, if I'm using these buttons, if I use the overwrite button, then what will happen is it will set the in point that I had on my source. It will match up to my positioner. It will overwrite, and then as you saw, it will take the cursor down the timeline to the next available empty frame. So I'm just going to undo that for a second. If I used to use the ripple button, it would do exactly the same as we had when I gesturally dragged it in. It will go through and ripple that, and then it will take it to the end of that cut. Now there's some combinations that we can actually use. So you can see here that we're using the in and the out point as a region, and we're using the positioner and the timeline as a specific in point. Now if I was to get rid of my in and out points here, so to reset pretty much anything in Flame, if you hold down the control key and then tap on the function, you can see that we can clear those in and out points. If we were to use the positioner in here with no in and outs, and the positioner in here with no in and outs, then it would use this positioner on the source as the in point, and it would use this positioner in the timeline also as my in point. So once again, if I did my my overwrite, if I did my this one, you can see what it's going to do is essentially it's just going to use that as the in point, overwrite the clip to the end of the timeline. And we're just going to undo. So what we're going to do now is quickly explore the combinations that you can do for this. So, you know, if we set an explicit in point in my clip but no out, and we move the cursor somewhere else, then it would be that in point mark there would go to where the cursor is sitting in the timeline. If I just clear that out and I set an out point here, then what would happen now is we're going to be doing some back timing. It would actually match the out to this point. So if we do an overwrite, you can see what's now going to happen is it's going to kind of basically back time the clip in there. I'll just undo that again. The out point will go to this match up. And really, everything from there is basically a variation on a theme. You know, if we came into my record and we set an in point, and we can move the cursor somewhere else, and then down in this clip we set it in and we set an out, and we did an overwrite, the in would go to the in on the timeline and the out will be wherever the clip runs out. I'm going to undo that again. Some of the really nice functionality though is where we can do things like fit to fills and also do new tracks. So at the moment we're doing like a single video track, but you know, maybe we want to start editing things into different tracks, or maybe we want to start doing things like fit to fills or cutaways. You know, maybe you just don't like working on a single video layer timeline. After all, like I said, it is 2017 and we do have multiple layers. So once again, whether you're a gestural person, and once again, if we set a quick in and out on here for a moment, if you're a gestural kind of guy or girl, you can pick this up, and instead of actually dropping it on the clip, if you hover it above, what will happen is it will make a new track to accommodate that video that we're dropping in. There's this new source. If you're going to be using the buttons, then it's a good idea to create a new track and make sure that our cross piece is actually focused on this. So this positioner here actually does two things. It not only says whereabouts in time do we want to edit into, but when we're using the hotkeys and these buttons, it also defines what track that video is going to be edited into. So once again, just as an example, I'm going to leave those ins and outs there. I've created a new empty track. My cross piece is here. If I hit overwrite, boom, it will overwrite into that video track. If I just undo that for a second and I move the cross piece down, now you can grab hold of that if you want to with the cursor, or over here you can see where the primary track, so this is the target track, you can also click in the box and make that the primary track. And now if I hit overwrite, you're going to see that it's going to overwrite into that video track. All right, so there's a couple of things there to sort of be aware of. Where your cross piece is, where your T-bar is, you know, that's going to be your track you're editing into. And also just be aware of your ins and outs on the timeline, as well as the position that you've got. But you know, if you play around with it, you'll get used to it pretty quickly. It's not completely alien to other editing applications, but there are some nuances in here that are just slightly different. So you get the general idea of ins and outs of the timeline, but what's quite nice about this is that we can also do things like fit to fills. So if I set an in point and an out point on my record sequence, that's massively different from my in and out point on my source. Now we're doing a 4-point edit. So the ins and outs here have to fit to the ins and outs on my timeline. So once again, if I do an overwrite, what will happen is that Flame will apply a time warp on here to make this fit here. So it's either going to speed it up or it's going to slow down depending on what the difference is between the source coming in and the ins and outs marked on your sequence. So just going to round off this section with a look at a few more of the editing functions and also an introduction to the timeline effects. We're actually going to break out the conforming to sort of like a part 2A video, just to try and keep them not too long each. So I'm just going to come back to my desktop for a second. And I'm going to show you another quite nice functionality that we can kind of use to edit some material in. So I'm going to select, click down and drag and select everything in my timeline. I'm actually just going to throw it away outside of there. And we're going to go back to kind of like the beginning. And if we look at these clips in turn, so if we come into like my standard player for a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of pre-decide on the areas that I kind of want to work with. So maybe set an in point there, out point there. I'm going to go through just very quickly to each of these clips. This is not going to be the nicest edit in the world, that is for sure. But the idea is that I'm just going to make some decisions on the ranges that I want to edit into my timeline. Now, once we've done all this, there's a nice feature inside of here that allows you to select, essentially it's selection sensitive. So if we kind of look back at my desktop for a second, I've got my all my clips here. I can select them from the reels, or I can select them inside of here. But if for argument's sake I say, well, I want that clip to be first, this to be second, this to be third, fourth, and fifth, Flame will remember the selection order as well as also preserving the ins and out points of those clips. So once I've made that selection, all I have to do is drag that down into the timeline, and what it's going to do is it's going to pre-put all those things together into my timeline, respect the ins and outs, but also respect the order in which I selected those clips. So it's another way you can kind of build up a rough cut quite quickly. Now, once we've actually built up a timeline, there's a good chance you probably want to go through and manipulate the clips inside of it as well. So just to keep this nice and simple, I'm actually going to select my audio for a second. I'm just going to throw it away, and I'm going to kind of get rid of this extra video track that was made, because I just want to kind of focus on basically trimming inside of the timeline and some of the other functionality. So if we look here, because we've got a predefined resolution for our timeline, you can see that there's sort of like the way that some of the crops are done are not particularly what we want it to be. You know, the smaller ones are kind of got this center crop behavior. The big one is kind of, it's kind of too zoomed in. I would like all of those to be consistent. Now, because we've applied automatically a resize to this, and this is an effect, this effect can actually be copied to multiple clips at once. So this is a timeline effect. We're going to look at timeline effects in a little bit more detail in a second, but essentially this is something that's been added as part of that process of making this timeline. Now, I'd like these to be all the same. I don't really want to go through each one and change each one individually, because that would be just a little bit dull. So if I pick a representative one, this one, I go to my resizing, I'm going to make that a letterbox. And then I basically select, I can hit this little knurled tab here to select and deselect, or I can do Control A to select the whole timeline. With that selection active, if I pick up the resize that I've just altered and drop it onto any of those selections, what will happen is that each of those clips will now be resized according to what I wanted. So you can see now that everything kind of nicely fits in. All the clips have the same resizing method on. So you can drag and drop those effects to a selection. So the editorial timeline inside of Flame is very much selection based in that respect. Now, of course, once you've got some objects in, once you've done your initial edit, chances are you probably want to go through, manipulate and trim those. And you're going to be using next to these tools, this little toolbox, right? So this gives you all your editorial tools that allow you to come through and do, pretty much the obvious things. We're not going to laboriously go through these. They're fairly self-explanatory if you've come from another editing system. So select basically just allows you to select and move clips around the timeline. It doesn't allow you to do anything else. If we come down to this, we can obviously select forwards and backwards from the current point on all tracks. But if we go to our trim tool, the trim tool is probably the one that you're going to be using most when you're doing the editing. The trim tool will respect, once again, the state of these buttons. So, if the trim tool is in non-ripple mode, then if we select a clip here, we sort of go towards the end of a particular clip and we grab hold of it, then of course what you're going to do is you're going to trim and you're going to leave a gap behind. We're not actually rippling. If we change the state of that to ripple, you can see that the status of the icon changes to reflect that, and we grab this, then surprise, surprise, then when we do a ripple edit, it's actually going to move the rest of the timeline accordingly, depending on what we're doing. So just be aware of that. The other functions as well, if we come down here, slip and slide, cuts and slide are all sort of fairly standard behaviors. We're slipping media inside, we're sliding the clip around on the timeline, and once again these will be aware of the state that you have the ripple button either on or off, so just kind of look out for that. The other thing that's kind of nice about this as well is that we can actually multi-select ins and outs or clips as well. So we can obviously tap and multi-select a whole clip and move those around the timeline. But also when we start to come to the edit points on these, we can actually select those as well. So if we tap down towards the end here, we've selected this. We've holding down control, we've selected the end of that as well. And then when we come down now and start trimming, you can see that we can multiple trim ins and outs simultaneously. And once again, depending on the state of the ripple button, you'll be doing that as well to the whole timeline. So either making gaps or rippling the whole time accordingly. So quite a flexible way of editing, a nice kind of tool set. Now, as I said, we're going to also explain a few more of the functions inside of here. So things like append and pre-append the edits, we're basically always adding to the end or adding to the front of the edit. Ripple replace and replace media, sort of fairly self-explanatory and fit to fill as well. But things like aligned edit, there's some nice functions in here that allow you to do some quite crafty editorial operations. So if we look down here, we're going to be using our buoy again for argument's sake. I know we've got this buoy at the beginning, but also we're going to be reusing it a little bit further down. Just want to show you a nice little feature. We're going to create a new track, and essentially, if we come into our source sequence view for a second, and we're going to select this, what happens if I want a certain frame to coincide with a piece of action on my record sequence here? So maybe if we look at our buoy and we just clear the existing ins and outs and say that, I don't know, for argument's sake, we want just as these two ships meet here to coincide with just as the bridge is kind of going out. Right now, on this, we're going to have an in and an out point. This is how long we want this section to last, but I actually want this frame to line up to this frame on my sequence. So it's going to have to obey the ins and out points, but it will also, in aligned edit mode, obey the positioner. So even though we have an in and an out on the source, we don't actually have an in and out on a sequence, but our positioner is lined up to where we want this frame to be. When we come in and we use the aligned edit function, what will happen is it will still respect the ins and outs, but it will actually align that frame to the frame that I chose down here. And this is another good example of this sort of crossbar T function that I've got here. Flame doesn't by default look from the top track down. It will always look down through the timeline stack from where this cross piece is. So it's kind of a little bit unusual from some other editors, and it can kind of catch you out occasionally. You can be saying, well, I've got all this other media, I've got all these other segments on another layer. Why am I not seeing them? Chances are that your primary track is actually looking at a lower layer. So just kind of always make sure that if you want to see things kind of correctly in a top-down orientation, that you've always got your cross piece or your primary track indicator at the top of the editing stack. So just going to remove that clip, just going to throw it away again. And I suppose the other standard things that you probably want to be able to do inside of a timeline is add some dissolves, maybe start adding some effects once you've kind of got your edit nailed down. So to do that, we need to look at some navigation. We also need to look at starting to select objects. Like I said, it's very much selection based, the timeline here. And if we leave snap enabled, it's always going to snap to particular places. It's going to be snapping to an edit point. It's going to be snapping to markers and other clips. Now, if you want to start navigating this without using the cursor, on your keyboard, if you use the up and down arrows, it will start to navigate between events on a particular track. So you can see here, it's actually ignoring all the events underneath, because the position of the cross piece, the primary track indicator, this part, is actually on an empty layer, which is 500 frames long, which is what we originally set our sequence to be. If we put the primary indicator down here, the cross piece, and we now use the up and down arrows on the keypad, it will now go to each event. Now, sometimes you're going to have events all over the place. You're going to have multiple layers, and it's going to be really awkward if it only jumps to the front and the end on a particular layer here. So if you hold down the control key, regardless of where the cross piece is, the primary track indicator is, it will always go to whatever event is next chronologically in the timeline on whatever layer. So control and up and down arrows will always take you to the previous and next events, regardless of where that cross piece is. So if we're going to start adding things like dissolves, we actually select the cut point. And a couple of things you need to be aware of in here. So if we look to the left-hand side of, when we select a segment, and like I said, we have this sort of basic pipeline of how it comes in, what we're doing to it on the timeline. But to the left of that, you've got these buttons for effects and transitions and dissolves. Now we'll look at effects in just a second, how we kind of add manually some of the things that get added automatically. But if we actually select a cut point, then this transition button becomes active and you get representation of the sort of like the out point and the in point of the clip that we're kind of working on. So once again, this is kind of selection based regardless of where the positioner is. So when we come down here, if we tap this, you can see we can add a variety of things. The action and match boxes are kind of like effects wipes. So we'll look at those when we start talking about effects. But if we just add a standard dissolve and we kind of zoom in, you can see that what we've actually now done is put a dissolve through at this point of a particular length and a particular style. So even after you've added the actual dissolve, you can decide, whether it needs to be up to the cut, from cut, or centered. Or you can even do a custom one as well. And inside here, you can determine the length of the dissolve, and obviously that's going to be governed by how many heads and tails that you have on your clips either side. Now, once again, as we said, because this is kind of like selection based, you can do some nice things. Okay, so if we kind of just grab hold of this, and it's probably good if you come back to your select tool, we can actually remove a dissolve. But if we went through and we selected maybe every dissolve that we've got, we can actually add dissolves to all those events in one go. Another thing that you could do is that if you'd added a particularly nice dissolve or a wipe and you made it a particular length on here, we can actually copy and drag that to other items inside the timeline. So if you remember in our first video back on the desktop where you could hold down Alt and Shift and you can drag out a copy of a clip, well, you can pretty much do the same thing with dissolves and effects on the timeline as well. So if we go back to our source sequence view for a second, we kind of zoom in a little bit, show you what's going on. If I hold down Alt and Shift while I'm actually dragging this off, I can drag off a copy of that, and then I can kind of line it up and drop it onto another cut. Now, probably actually what's a little bit more simpler than that, I'm just going to drag that dissolve across, is actually if we select it and do Control C, and then we can go through, we can Control select our other cut points and hit Control V, and we can paste all those dissolves in one go. So it's a very sort of flexible way of working, but you're thinking more of being selection based on kind of what you want to copy and paste and move around in the timeline. So lastly in this section, we're just going to have a very quick look at effects. So effects are once again sort of technically objects that you're going to attach or place onto a clip. And you can see that on some of these, when in the process of matching them into the resolution of the timeline, some timeline effects have already been applied, in this particular case resizes and time warps. But if you want to add something a little bit more extra to that, say you want to start doing some color correction or some text, then we've got a tool down here called effects next to our dissolve button that brings up a little palette of tools that we can apply. Now the tools in here are mainly to enable you to do quick timeline effects, color corrects, DVEs, picture in pictures, that sort of thing. They're also here to facilitate the translation of XMLs and AAFs into the Flame timeline. So you're going to see that when you start working with some of those coming from Avid, coming from Final Cut, that as part of the conforming process, some of these effects will be applied automatically depending on how that particular process was laid out in those other applications. However, we can come through and we can add these ourselves for creative looks. Now, this is broken up into two sections. We've got to the right of this dividing bar the most useful effects that we can have in a timeline. These are actually a subset of the batch tool set, and in theory all the batch tools could be exposed, but we've got another way of working for those. So these are like kind of quick effects that you want to do. To the left of that, we've got batch effects. Now batch effects we're going to come into on a separate video, but as far as the timeline goes, they're all considered as effects that we're going to apply to a segment or to a gap. Now it's a bit of a long reach, keep going over here. So, sometimes when you're working, you just want to start adding some effects. So on a particular clip, if you hold down Control and hit the tab button, it will bring up that palette directly above the segment that you're working on. And then you can go through and you can start adding the effects that you want. So if we added like a color correct, that's a fairly obvious one. You can see that a color correction is now being added after the resize. Now, most of these effects we can kind of rearrange in an order, but some you can't. So time warp and resize are pretty much sort of fixed. We couldn't have a resize at the end of the pipe or a time warp at the end of the pipe. They would generally be at the beginning of the effects that are stacked up on here. But things like color corrects and blurs and masks and some other operations, we can rearrange to suit our needs as we want. So in this particular case, with the color corrector selected, you can see that once again we have some quick tools down here just to go through and manipulate those, offsets, colors, and through the drop downs we can go through and adjust individual channels, master, shadows, midtones, and highlights. Now, what is actually buried underneath each of these quick toolbar access effects is a full-blown module. All the tools can be exposed. So when you have a particular effect selected, you're going to see down here that you've got always an editor button. Now you can either double tap on the effect or you can go into the editor button, and what will happen is it will take you to an interface that exposes all of the tools for that particular effect. So here, for argument's sake, we can see that this is the segment that we're working on. Maybe we want to kind of work on a little bit more on sort of like the contrast and the gain. Maybe we want to sort of play around with some of the color balance as well. Add a bit of a tint to it, correct it, whatever you want to do. We're applying it, and we've got access to all the tools for this particular effect module. Now, like I said, there's some hotkeys that we really want to learn quite quickly, and we have a concept when we start looking inside a batch of what the original was and what the result is, and we call it the front view and we call it the result view. So here in this view, if we hit F1, we can see the original front view. This is without the correction, and if we hit on the function keys F4, we can see the result of our color correction. So it's kind of nice. We've got a quick way of seeing before and after, and when we start looking at batch, we'll also start looking at split viewports and wipe bars as well. But for the moment, like I said, we're just taking this nice and easy just to get you familiar. So when you're happy with kind of whatever you're doing, we can kind of exit out of this module. We're still actually in the timeline, and you can see that that effect is now applied, that color correction, to this particular clip. The little blue buttons next to them allow you to temporarily mute that effect. And once again, some of the ones that you can't mute is where we've used a resize or a time warp to actually make this clip fit into the resolution and frame rate of the timeline. Now, once again, if you particularly like an effect, just the same way that we did with the dissolve, we can actually go through and select everything inside a particular timeline. We could drag that effect off, or we can actually just pick this up and we could drop it onto another clip, which then will have the same kind of look. These effects can also be added pretty much like in things like Photoshop as an adjustment layer, so they can actually be added onto an empty layer. So if we were to take our color correct from here and pick it up, we can actually drop it onto a gap layer. Now this means that it's going to kind of double this up. So on these ones that we added that color correction to, we're just going to mute it for a second. But on this particular layer, we now have that color correction applied as a gap layer. So once again, if we go up to our primary, everything that is below this clip is now going to be affected by that effect. And the nice thing about working with gap layers, we can treat them as actual physical editing layer. So we could put an edit point in by hitting X. We could put a splice point in. We can pick up a gap. I know this doesn't make any sense, but this is an empty layer, but it's got an effect on. We could throw that away. And now what you can see is that that effect will actually turn off after that particular point, or we could put a fade on or whatever. Once again, gap layers are subject to all the same editing tools that we use on actual video segments. So we can actually go through and we could trim out a gap layer or trim in or cut it up some more, put some gaps in. Gaps within the gaps, but some would have effects and some wouldn't, if you can understand that. So like I said, it's not going to be massively comprehensive on all the effects that we've got. We're going to actually do a conform next, and we're going to work a little bit more in depth with some of the effects, and especially start looking at things like batch effects as well. But hopefully this gives you a bit of a feel for how to get some things into a timeline, how to build your own timeline, do some trimming, do some editing, and then start exploring some of those effects. You'll soon get the hang of it, put effects on, play around with the settings. You'll work it out pretty quickly, but it's just that moment of getting started. So like I said, we're going to do a little break here. We're going to go into a video 2A just to finish off the side with editing. We're going to talk about some conforming and an introduction into batch effects, and then we're going to do batch effects on a nice separate video. So we'll see you then.